The video you're about to watch is from the Brand Podcast Summit, brought to you by Lower Street. We're a podcast agency for brands. This was a 2-day event that brought together some massive companies like the New York Times, LA Times, Morgan Stanley, Atlassian, REI, YouTube, Spotify, a ton of companies, all gathered to talk about what has worked for them in podcasting and not worked for them over the last 12 months. And looking forward, what are they planning and looking at over the next 12 months? So if you're a marketer looking at podcasting this year, or you have a podcast and you're looking to improve on it or get more out of it, I think you're going to find a ton of value here. And so for more videos just like this one, head over to lowerstreet.co/events. And you'll also find information there about future conferences and summits we have coming up. So head over to lowerstreet.co/events.
The Brand Podcast Summit.
So we're getting ready to start the session with Raquel Bubar. Raquel is the Managing Director of T Brand Studio International, which is the content studio of the New York Times. And today she is going to be sharing with you and presenting From Podcast to Print, Unlocking the Full Potential of Your Brand Storytelling. So a lot of times we find that brands will launch a podcast and the podcast kind of lives in isolation, and brands don't take advantage of all of the storytelling and all of the amazing research that they've done to go into the podcast. And so we wanted Raquel to come and share how the New York Times and how T Brand sort of looks at making 360 campaigns and translating some of that content into other platforms and other media. And T Brand does this incredibly well. So we are very thrilled to have Raquel here today. Remember that there is a Q&A function here, so put all of your questions in the Q&A chat, and then at the end I will pop in and I'll facilitate that and ask those questions to Raquel as well. So we'll answer your questions at the end. And without further ado, Raquel, I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, Annalisa. So great to be here. Thanks so much for having me. I want to thank everybody for inviting me here today to share with you a little bit about how we're thinking about podcasting at the New York Times. The New York Times mission is to seek the truth and help people understand the world. Audio is an important element of this mission to help people understand the world and an incredible vehicle for brands to make an impact. Our advertisers at the New York Times are fully realizing the power that audio has for their brands, from impactful 30-second spots played during our hit podcasts like The Daily to our custom-made brand podcasts that span multiple episodes, which I'll tell you about today. The world of traditional advertising can often be one-sided. It's often brands pushing content at consumers and hoping consumers see it or encounter it and are persuaded to take an action. In that sense, ads often speak at us. However, audio has the opportunity for audiences to engage and connect with the brand more deeply. It can be used as a conversational format. It has the power to convey emotion in the sounds you hear, and the audiences can connect personally in an immersive way. Our newsroom is tapping into this, creating hit shows listened to by tens of millions of people, providing a variety of stories and interviews to help audiences make sense of the world. It's likely you've listened to a New York Times podcast, even without knowing it. Have you listened to Serial? Or maybe This American Life? And our podcasts are running alongside similar trustworthy content on our digital, print, and social media channels. And we have the data to prove that audiences are receptive to audio advertising in our New York Times podcasts. In fact, the data tells us that 3 in 5 listeners are receptive to advertising in New York Times podcasts, and 3 out of 4 listeners say that advertising can improve their opinion of the brand. So because of the success of the newsroom's hit podcasts and the favorability it creates for advertisers, our New York Times advertising department and the branded content team at T Brand Studio have been busy creating brand opportunities in audio over the last few years. To give you an understanding of our journey into audio advertising, I'll first say that T Brand Studio's capabilities have evolved over the years. What you see on the screen here is a branded content destination page we call a paid post. We've developed an impressive array of award-winning digital storytelling using documentary-style videos, 3D design work, custom animations, and even augmented reality. And while we've done incredibly creative things in these singular spaces, we've since come to realize that our readers aren't only interested in seeing a standalone branded content page. In fact, Our readers are not just willing to, but they're expecting to engage more deeply with advertiser content across the New York Times channels. We've therefore evolved into something like this, advertising across our branded content suite across the full wingspan of the New York Times in online news and games, print, events, and of course, audio. To encourage deeper engagement, we are building storytelling that works across all the corners of the New York Times. So how do we do this? Whenever an advertiser comes to us and shows us an interest in reaching new audiences, we look across our New York Times channels to analyze how their audiences are interacting with our content, so we can reach them when they're in the right mindset and mood. Many of our subscribers and our readers engage with the New York Times multiple times a day. So maybe this is like you. They start their morning with the front page of the newspaper, or a morning briefing newsletter in their inbox, or maybe the daily podcast on their commute to work. They take short breaks during the day to play a game like Wordle or Spelling Bee, or to check the latest sports news in The Athletic. And at the end of the day, they look for inspiration and creativity, deciding what recipe to make their family with the New York Times cooking app, decompressing with health and wellness coverage or lifestyle long reads, or listening to a recording by one of our journalists reading out their latest story. As you can see, audio is an essential part of our audience's experience with the New York Times. It's also an important method for impactful storytelling. And in the advertising department, we recently partnered with 2 global brands looking to capture authentic storytelling and build conversations with new audiences. Cartier was focused on love and relationships, and L'Oreal wanted to discuss beauty in unexpected ways. Audio for them was a new way to tackle these topics, not only showing their creative ingenuity, but also to reach new audiences, unlocking more opportunities for deeper engagement. Okay, so I'll begin with a project we did for Cartier. A few years ago, Cartier and T Brand Studio partnered together to interview New Yorkers about their love of New York City, and we printed their stories in the newspaper of the New York Times. The campaign received so many positive comments from readers that it begged the question, what else could we do together? Could we create a more 360-degree campaign using the full wingspan of the New York Times platforms to reach their audiences in more places? Our concept, 100 Loves for 100 Years. We would help Cartier own the topic of love across the New York Times by publishing 100 stories to mark their 100th anniversary of their iconic Trinity ring. We would find an incredible array of positions to place them in, and included sections of the Times that our readers were loyal to. Of course, to do that, audio played a critical role in our success. The year was also the 25th anniversary of the New York Times legendary column about love and relationships, Modern Love. The column is such a cultural phenomenon, it's been turned into a book, an Amazon Prime television show, and a hit podcast. What better timing than to coincide Cartier's 100th anniversary of their iconic Trinity ring than with our own column's anniversary? So we rolled out a platform that allowed Cartier to be present everywhere love was mentioned on the New York Times. Our concept of 100 Loves lived across New York Times print pages, digital website, and in audio spots that played in the Modern Love podcast. Our T Brand Studio journalists captured 100 unique stories about love from countries around the world. Love that was multifaceted, not just romantic love. Love between mothers and children, friends and family, as well as self-love. The production had a number of challenges too, because the sheer volume and quantity of 100 stories we needed to capture from so many different countries all over the world required the commitment of T Brand creative teams that we have in New York, London, Paris, and Singapore. We worked across time zones with translators to ensure we could capture stories quickly and accurately without losing their heart. We also quickly found out that when people talk about love, and we have lots of interest in people talking about love, they often become incredibly philosophical or cliche. And we didn't want that. We wanted real, authentic storytelling that would resonate with our readers. And our commitment paid off, producing a beautiful cover wrap, which you see here, a spread in the newspaper, and a sponsorship of the magazine. So anywhere that love was mentioned on the New York Times, Cartier was nearby. And to truly capture the emotion of these written stories, audio proved to be an incredible method. The recordings that we played in Modern Love are based on the interviews that we printed in the newspaper and online. So I had planned to play for you 2 clips here that ran in the Modern Love podcast. I'll click one and we'll see if it works. If it doesn't, then I'd be more than happy to send them around afterwards.
This podcast is supported by Cartier.
Works.
As far back as I can remember, my mom and I have always had this double hand squeeze. Twice in a row means I love you. She told me that it signifies like your heartbeat because it goes twice. So every time she squeezes it, it just means that she loves me with all her heart. I remember one time when I was 7, I had this really bad nightmare. And so I clambered out of bed and I ran to my mom and dad's room. And then I remember that my mom, I don't know if she was fully awake or not, but she must have realized that I'd come in because she tapped me twice on my arm. It makes me feel happy, like really loved, like no matter what I'm thinking at the time, no matter what is happening around us, I know that my mom loves me and she will always love me.
With love from Cartier. This podcast is supported by Cartier.
Noelle was in London for a couple of weeks and we met on a dating app and we went on a first date on a Wednesday, and by the Thursday we were booking flights to Lisbon together. So it was a very successful first date. We just kept thinking this could be the last time we see each other. So we just made every moment so special. Every coffee, every meal we went on, every dance party we went to, it was like that was all that mattered. That was the moment, and we just felt everything, felt so much love for each other in that moment, and then the rest didn't matter. She's not ever been shy to make me feel loved, and she's never held back on making me feel special. And that to me is so important. From the day I met her, she made me feel like the most special person in the world. And now she's my wife.
With love from Cartier.
So as you can hear in these recordings, audio allowed us to bring the written stories to life in a whole new way, with voices that conveyed their personality, emotion, and authenticity. We wouldn't have achieved this campaign in such a compelling way without the power of audio. Through our campaign, love was not just seen and read about, because to truly feel it, love needed to be heard. I want to continue with another example of creative audio work we did in collaboration with L'Oréal Group. Audio became a solution for them because it provided long, sustained periods of brand engagement and the ability for listeners to hear intimate conversations. Unlike a campaign that focuses solely on quick scroll digital ads or fleeting impressions, audio offered them uninterrupted listening and deep connections with new audiences. L'Oréal was about to announce the launch of a new study that was 20 years in the making. It's titled The Essentiality of Beauty, and it aimed to reveal the universal and essential role that beauty plays in our lives. Often, beauty is viewed as a superficial topic, sometimes confined to a grocery store aisle or a social media beauty tutorial. And this misconception overlooks key audiences like business leaders and policymakers, who may not see the relevance of discussing beauty and as a result tend to take the topic less seriously. So to change this narrative, L'Oréal Group turned to the New York Times for guidance. And together, our campaign marked their first ever collaboration with a media organization to help beauty be taken more seriously. We started with the premise that every news story is also a beauty story. On the surface, it may appear to be about politics or technology, health, or science, but there's so much impact that beauty has on these topics that goes undiscussed. And we're talking beauty in the broadest sense of the word, that beauty is impacting everyone and everything. So together, we developed a digital, print, and audio campaign to prove to our audience that beauty is everywhere and it's in every story. First, L'Oreal sponsored a new body of important journalism titled Face Value, which expands beauty coverage on the New York Times. They then ran ads across the series highlighting important and interesting facts about beauty's impact on the world. And then we launched our podcast, and I'm going to play for you the trailer so you get a flavor of what the episodes were like.
Do you think when I say the word beauty? Is it silly? Is it frivolous? Is it fun? Do you only think of makeup? Or do you ever think of your favorite athlete?
You find players telling me if they don't get a haircut, they don't feel like they lace the boots up properly.
Advanced technology.
You look down the microscope and there are all these fibers just laid out exquisitely. It takes your breath away, really.
Or the economy?
The lipstick effect is a very interesting phenomenon where it's kind of a puzzle from an economic standpoint.
Many people don't take it very seriously, but beauty plays an essential role in the human experience. Hello there, I'm Isabella Rossellini, and as an actress and model, beauty has shaped the industry in which I made my name. And now, in this new series from L'Oréal Group, I'm exploring the hidden role beauty plays in other important areas of modern life, from sports and business to technology and more. Together, we will travel from Paris.
We have one salon for 1,000 people in France. That's the average. In Paris, we would need 2,500 salons to answer the needs.
To Amsterdam.
They said like within 3 weeks of starting your chemotherapy, you'd know if you're gonna lose your hair.
To Seoul.
No matter where you go in the world, you will not find men and women who love cosmetics and beauty, skincare as much as those in South Korea.
And Washington, D.C.
The moment I felt like I had made it, per se, was when I started working very closely with Mrs. Obama in the White House and after the White House years.
We'll get to the heart of how beauty is woven through every facet of our lives. Listen now to This Is Not a Beauty Podcast, brought to you by L'Oréal Group.
The voice you heard hosting the podcast is the recognizable Isabella Rossellini. She hosted the 6-episode series and was a brilliant voice to the story. Each new episode went live every 2 weeks and touched on a range of topics, from beauty and politics to sports, science, and technology. The interview format we chose allowed for conversations that felt personal and emotional. And as you can see, each episode was a collection of human stories that began with universally relevant news topics and revealed the essentiality of beauty within them. To give you an idea of the unexpected characters, stories, and the talent that we selected, our first episode, our politics episode, was a story about power and influence. We had the chance to talk to Carl Ray, Michelle Obama's makeup artist, on how he works hard to keep the focus on what politicians are saying rather than how they look. We also interviewed Lars Krutak, a tattoo anthropologist, writer, and photographer, and Apo Wang Odd, a 107-year-old tattoo artist, on what tattoos mean in her culture in the Philippines. So you can see the variety of talent and the topics we covered in rather unexpected ways in one episode alone. And then there was the sports episode, which turned out to be a story about exceptional performance. We learned that confidence and identity go hand in hand. We spoke with Olympic gold medalist sprinter Noah Lyles, who is not just known for his speed, but also for his bold hairstyles and his elaborately painted nails, which you don't often see on men, let alone male athletes. And Noah's fearless self-expression, combined with his vibrant personality, made him the perfect person to talk about how confidence in one's own self-image can actually fuel peak performance. This was a truly global podcast that spanned interviews in multiple languages and countries. We needed to reflect the stories that our audiences at the New York Times would be curious about, and to help them better understand the world around them. Audio was a critical portion of the campaign, which played out across all of our platforms, not just as traffic drivers, but as full bodies of journalism that our audiences could engage with. We earned sustained listening time and recognition for our storytelling in collaboration with L'Oreal Group, and that put us high up in the podcast ranks. This Is Not a Beauty podcast now ranks in the top 1.5% of the most popular shows globally out of several million podcasts, according to the podcast measurement platform Listen Notes. And in its first week that we launched, it ranked in the top 1% and was among the top 100 most listened to podcasts in the United States. So just to summarize, we're consistently taking a holistic approach to branded content at the New York Times advertising department. Audio has been an essential part of our campaign strategy and our media mix for advertisers. If we really want to offer value to brands and help them reach the audiences they need, we will continue building campaigns that span multiple places across the New York Times. This gives them the opportunity to reach more audiences in authentic ways across our platform. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Raquel.
Thank you.
This has been so lovely. So now we are going to jump into our Q&A session. Just a reminder to people, you can throw your question in the chat now as well, and I will see it there and ask. But to start, there were quite a few questions around collaboration. So looking at the way that your team works with the client, and then also, I think when it comes to this sort of work and you're talking about like multiple different platforms, it's not just, your team working with the L'Oreal team, for example, but it's also your team, the L'Oreal team, and then you've got like a print team and an audio team and a digital team. Like, how does everybody sort of work together to pull this off? And what does that collaboration look like?
Okay, so that's a fantastic question. And it can be really challenging because we are working across time zones, because T Brand Studio International is based in several different countries. And likewise, the client. I mean, the client for L'Oreal Group, for example, is based in Paris. They also have stakeholders in New York, and they have the talent that we were working with, which is also located. There's really no easy answer because, it is a challenge. It's always a challenge. But as long as you get the whole team focused on the goal and the mission of the project, and in this case, it was a really important mission. It was to get beauty to be taken more seriously. And if you do it in the New York Times, it automatically feels like it's being taken more seriously. So kind of if you get everyone to align, for us, it felt like if we got everyone to align with the same mission, that really helped with everyone working towards the same goal and making sure that collaboration worked together.
And how do you sort of land on the mission? Like, who is sort of bringing that to the table? Is that coming from like L'Oreal? Like, how fully formed are things when they come in the door from the client? How fully formed was it from L'Oreal, for example, when it came in the door?
Okay, so this wasn't fully formed. It was a real collaboration, probably a year in the making at all levels between our companies. We started with the missions of both of our companies. And for the New York Times, it's to help people understand the world, to seek the truth and help people understand the world. And so in the ad department, we were wondering, how can we find the truth in the subject that L'Oreal really cares a lot about? And for us, that was the connection. And like I say, it was lots of different levels. We have a fantastic strategy team and program management team that were also really heavily involved in that thought process to figure it out. But yeah, that's kind of how we landed on it, was the mission of our companies.
Okay. There's a question in the chat, says related to the question that you just answered. Would love to hear how your firewall comes into play as well. Are you able to work with the editorial or the news staff, or do you have to disclose if talent are paid for their participation, etc.? So how does that sort of work with T Brand?
Yeah, that's a great question because different publishers work differently. So at the New York Times, we have a very hard wall between our advertising and business side and our newsroom side. And so we call it kind of church and state relationship. So on the advertising side, we try to live up to the same standards, creative standards, as the New York Times newsroom. We try to follow the same journalistic principles. And all of the writers on T Brand Studio in the business side in T Brand Studio come from journalism backgrounds. That's why it's so compelling as well for advertisers, because they're not just working with another advertising team or marketing team. They're working with journalists who are coming at this work in a really unique storytelling, authentic storytelling way. So that's kind of the secret that we bring to the table. And yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, totally. Totally. No, I think that makes sense. So it's separation, but you're working with people who have sort of the same skill set and are like aligned with the same mission.
We can't really influence what the newsroom is doing per se. They can sponsor a body of journalism, but the brand won't really have any control over it. What they do have control over is the creative work that we're making in the advertising team.
Awesome. So like for the example with Cartier, it's like they have control over the ads that are running in Modern Love. They don't have control over the actual content of a Modern Love episode, for example.
Exactly. The wonderful thing, yes, exactly. And the wonderful thing about that Cartier program was the stories that we were telling. We were bringing such good, authentic journalism to those stories. They're real stories. Like, and you can see when we printed it as well, like it also has the name of the person and the location where that person is living. So it feels very global. It feels very, diverse. And like that feels very true to who the New York Times is. And we're trying to bring that in all kind of facets of the way we're telling our stories.
Awesome. Yeah, it definitely comes through. And I think that's the best way to approach brand content generally. So I have another question here. It says, how much value does the audio product have in your sales packages versus the digital and print footprints in the New York Times? Are people looking for that digital/print reach first and you upsell audio, or is audio the starting point for the conversation? I'm very curious about this as well. Like, have you seen sort of a shift in this at the New York Times in recent years? How many people come in the door and are like just looking for audio, and then you build out the rest of the package around audio, and how much of it is something that starts as print and you sort of build in audio as part of that?
Yeah. So we have evolved over the years. I mean, as the New York Times is a very innovative company, we're always looking for new ways of telling stories. The newsroom is looking for new ways to tell stories, and audio is just one way for them to do that. And so we look at this, like if an advertiser comes to us and says, I want to do a program with the New York Times, we don't necessarily jump to a particular format, whether it's audio or video or 3D design or, anything that's kind of in our arsenal. We first think about what that story is and whether it will land well in the medium. And like, I think anybody listening to this today that has audio expertise could tell you that not every story is right for a podcast. So even if we had an advertiser come to us with who was curious about audio curious, like it wouldn't necessarily be the right format for them. So we always start with what is their story that they're trying to tell? Who is their audience that they're trying to reach? I showed you kind of the arc of the engagement that our New York Times readers have with us. Sometimes their audience will be more interested in audio. Sometimes they'll be more interested in games or cooking or The Athletic, and we kind of map it to that. And that kind of dictates how we do it. So no, we're not really thinking about how we're building the upsell or fitting something in or something like that. It's kind of, we just start with what is the plan, what's the story, and what are the best mediums for us to tell that in.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best approach there, right? You want to make sure that the medium fits the content for sure. I'm going to ask you one last question. This is based on one of the questions in the chat, but I'd love to hear your insight into this as well. Brands who are coming to work with T Brand obviously are coming with pretty large budgets. So some of these projects are, they're extensive and you have pretty big teams working on them. For a brand that's maybe a little bit smaller, that doesn't have that kind of reach at this point or that kind of a budget yet, what would you sort of recommend as a first step if they're looking to maximize the benefit of their podcast? Say they've already got a podcast going now, and it's doing pretty well, but they're looking at, how can I turn this into something that's more 360? How can I maximize what I'm doing with this podcast and turn it into something bigger? What would be like a first step that you would recommend? Or where do you see like the best sort of what medium works the best with that sort of content, have you found?
Yeah, great question. So I showed today two types of audio executions. One is these like short standalone stories that live in existing New York Times podcasts, and another execution, which is much bigger, bolder type of campaign, more robust campaign, is the L'Oreal Group project, which is to create a 6-episode standalone wonderful piece of work. Those are kind of two executions, and you can scale those types of work up or down, even with the New York Times. And I would also say, like, thinking about the positioning and the alignment in our 40 plus shows that we have to offer, there are probably smart ways for you to be promoting your podcast in our podcasts in just like more snackable, short ways. I wouldn't exclude audio just because of a budget, simply because there's probably a lot of cool creative ways that we can do it. Just like with digital, you can scale that up or scale that down depending on what kind of multimedia you want to be doing with that storytelling. So yeah, no, I'd encourage you to explore the format, and we're finding a lot of success with it. So yeah, please feel free to reach out to me or anyone on the T Brand Studio team if you're curious about it.
Great. Thank you. So I think we're currently at time, so we're going to take a quick break. We're about 2 minutes over, and that's perfect. This has been great. So thank you so much, Raquel. This has been really excellent. We learned a lot, and we will be back in about 7 minutes for our next session.
Thank you so
everybody
much.
Can take a quick bio break.
Great. It's been wonderful to be here. Appreciate it. And yeah, good to see everyone. Thank you.
Good to see you too. Bye.
The Brand Podcast Summit.